There was a box hidden behind a false wall in her closet, and inside that box was 5 years of my life written in my handwriting. Letters I never wrote, sent to my husband. Letters that slowly, quietly made him believe I didn't love him anymore. She smiled at me every Sunday at dinner. She called me daughter, and the whole time she was erasing me. I need you to understand something before I tell you this story.
Look at these before you say anything.
I am not a dramatic person. I don't look for conflict. I don't gossip. I don't hold grudges. I was raised by a woman who believed that a quiet life was a blessed life, and for 31 years I tried to live by that. I kept my head down. I worked hard. I loved my husband with everything I had. I welcomed his family into my home, into my heart, into the space where my trust lived. And I want you to hold on to that image of me, the woman who set an extra plate at the table every Sunday without being asked, who sent birthday cards 3 weeks early, who once drove 2 hours in a snowstorm to bring soup to a woman who didn't even like me. Because what I'm about to tell you will only make sense if you understand who I was before it all fell apart. The first time I felt it, that cold, sideways wrongness, I was standing in my own kitchen. I remember the exact moment. It was a Tuesday in March. The kind of March that can't make up its mind, half snow, half slush, the sky the color of old concrete. I was making tea, the kind of ordinary thing you do 1,000 times without thinking about it, and my mother-in-law Miriam was sitting at my kitchen table. She was visiting. She visited often. She was talking, she was always talking, and then she said something that stopped the breath in my chest without making a single sound. She said, "Nadia, do you ever worry that Daniel feels lonely?" I turned around slowly. Daniel was my husband. We had been married for 4 years at that point. We lived in a comfortable house. We laughed every day. We were trying to have a baby. He was the person I told everything to, the last voice I heard before sleeping. Lonely. What do you mean, Miriam? She smiled. She had this smile, soft, careful, the kind of smile that could mean anything. "Oh, nothing, sweetheart. Forget I said it. He just mentioned he misses spending time with you, but he understands you're busy. He really does." She picked up her tea and took a sip, and I stood there with the kettle in my hand, and something in my chest shifted 3 millimeters to the left. Just 3 millimeters. Not enough to alarm me. Just enough to notice. I forgot about it by the time Daniel came home. He brought takeout. We watched a movie. I fell asleep on his shoulder. Everything was fine. Everything was completely fine. I want to tell you exactly how I met Daniel because I think it matters. I think the happiness of the beginning is the part that made the middle so impossible to survive. I was 26. I was working at an architecture firm, not designing yet, mostly drafting and spec checking, but I loved it. There was a project across the street, a renovation of an old textile warehouse into residential lofts, and the construction crew had this one foreman who kept showing up at our office with questions he didn't actually need answered. He would ask things he clearly already knew. He would stand in our doorway with blueprints rolled under his arm and this completely transparent excuse to exist near me. His name was Daniel Harmon. He was 30 at the time. Brown hair that curled when it got long. Eyes that were gray in some lights and green in others. He laughed the way some people breathe, frequently, naturally, like he couldn't help it. He asked me to dinner 4 times before I said yes, and when I finally said yes, he actually pumped his fist in the parking lot when he thought I wasn't looking. I watched through the window. I laughed for 5 minutes straight. We dated for 2 years. We were careful about it, not slow, just thorough. We wanted to know each other's broken parts before we committed to them. I told him about my father's alcoholism and the years I spent as a teenager making myself very small and very quiet in a loud, unpredictable house. He told me about his first engagement, a woman named Cressida 3 years before me who had left him for his closest friend. He told me it had changed the way he trusted people. He said it carefully, like a warning. I love hard, and when it goes wrong, it goes very wrong for me. I held his face in my hands and I said, I know. Me too. Let's be careful with each other. He proposed on a Sunday morning in our pajamas, not with a ring, that came later, but with a piece of paper he'd folded into a very bad origami swan that said, "Will you?" In his handwriting, which was terrible, by the way. Blocky and childlike, and somehow the most beautiful handwriting I'd ever seen. I said yes before he even finished unfolding it. Miriam came to the wedding. Of course she did, she was his mother. She wore a cream dress that was, I noticed, almost white. Not quite. Just almost. She hugged me at the reception and whispered in my ear, "He deserves to be so happy." It felt in the moment like the kindest thing anyone had ever said to me. I cried a little. She patted my back. I would think about that sentence differently later. He deserves to be so happy. Not, "You'll make him happy." Not, "I'm so glad you're in the family." Just, he deserves it. Like happiness was a thing he was owed, and I was merely the current arrangement. But I didn't hear it that way then. Then I just cried and held her hands and felt grateful. The first 3 years of our marriage were the kind of years you look back on like old photographs, slightly soft, warm-toned, slightly unreal. We argued sometimes, the way real people do, about money and time and whose turn it was to call the plumber. But we always came back to center. We always came back to laughing. He still brought me takeout on random Tuesdays. I still left notes in his coat pockets. We were trying for a baby and it wasn't happening yet, which was its own private grief, but we held it together. We held each other. Miriam visited every 2 weeks. She lived 40 minutes away. She was widowed. Daniel's father had died when Daniel was 19, and she had built her entire emotional world around her son. I understood it. I even respected it in a complicated way. She was a woman who loved fiercely and had learned that love could be taken without warning. I understood that too. What I didn't understand, what I didn't let myself understand for far too long, was how carefully she had studied me. How much time she spent watching the specific architecture of my marriage, mapping the load-bearing walls, identifying which ones could be quietly, gradually removed. The second sign came about 6 months after the kitchen conversation. I was going through the mail, we kept a little basket on the entry table, and I found an envelope that had already been opened. This wasn't unusual. Daniel sometimes opened things absent-mindedly. But the letter inside wasn't for Daniel. It was from my college roommate Priya, addressed to me. A handwritten note, the kind Priya sent sometimes, old-fashioned and warm. The note itself was fine, a birthday message, some updates about her life, an inside joke. Nothing alarming. But the envelope had been opened. Carefully. The kind of careful that looks like an accident. I asked Daniel that night if he'd opened it. He looked at it, frowned, shook his head. Maybe it came that way. I let it go. What I didn't know then was that Miriam had a habit, when she visited, of checking the mail if she arrived before we got home from work. She had a key. We'd given it to her for emergencies. She used it approximately every 2 weeks. I didn't connect those dots yet. I want to be honest about that. I want to own the fact that my trust was so complete, so total, that I gave every piece of evidence an innocent explanation before I'd even finished looking at it. The 4th year of our marriage was when things started to shift in ways I could no longer paper over with good intentions. Daniel changed. Not dramatically, not in the way people describe when someone has a breakdown or starts doing something obviously wrong. It was subtler than that. He started being quiet in ways that felt pointed. He would look at me across the dinner table, sometimes with this expression I couldn't read, not coldness exactly. More like doubt. Like he was running calculations and the numbers weren't working out. He stopped reaching for my hand in public. Not every time, not in a way you could point to and say, "There, that's the moment." Just enough fewer times that the absence became its own presence. I asked him one night after dinner, sitting in the kitchen with wine, if something was wrong. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Do you love living here? Like, are you happy?" I was confused. "Of course I am, why would you ask that?" He shrugged. He turned his wine glass. "I don't know, sometimes I feel like you're here but not fully here, like your mind is somewhere else." I felt a sharp, disorienting panic, the kind you feel when someone describes you in a way that doesn't match any version of yourself you recognize. "Daniel, I don't know where that's coming from, I'm completely here." He nodded. He didn't look convinced. I lay awake that night, cycling through the past several weeks trying to find the thing I had missed, the behavior that could be read as distance. I couldn't find it. I was racking my brain and I could not find it. Which left me with a question I wasn't ready to answer. If I hadn't changed, where was he getting this story? I started paying attention differently after that. Not to Daniel, to Miriam. I began noticing the timing of things. Her visits almost always happened when I was at work for a long day and Daniel was home earlier. She would be there when he arrived, already in our kitchen, already having coffee, already talking. She had a talent for catching him in the gap between work tired and home comfortable, when he was slightly unguarded and she was warm and familiar and waiting. I noticed that after her visits, he was always slightly more distant with me. Not always, but often enough that it stopped being a coincidence. I noticed that she would ask questions, casual, gentle questions about our life. How are things? How's Nadia doing at work? Does she seem stressed? She asked Daniel these questions, not me. She gathered information about me the way you might gather stones, quietly one at a time until you had enough weight. I told my best friend Cecile about it over coffee. Cecile was sharp and warm and one of the best people I've ever known. I explained the pattern as I saw it. She listened carefully. Then she said, Nadia, I love you, but you might be spiraling a little. Not every mother-in-law is a villain. Maybe Daniel is just going through something and she's his comfort person. I nodded. She was probably right. I was spiraling. Daniel was stressed about work. Miriam was just present. I was reading darkness into ordinary things. Probably. Except that 2 weeks later I found the first letter. It was folded inside a book on Daniel's nightstand, a book I'd lent him 6 months earlier that I wanted to reread, so I picked it up without thinking. The letter fell out. My handwriting was on the envelope. My name in the return address corner. I opened it before I'd consciously decided to. The letter was written on ivory paper. It used my vocabulary, words I used, rhythms that sounded like me. It was dated 8 months prior. And it was addressed to Daniel. And it talked about how suffocated I felt in our marriage. How I sometimes daydreamed about a different life. How I was grateful to him but worried I had made the wrong choice. I had not written this letter. I stood in our bedroom with that letter in my hands and I felt the floor shift under me. Not literally, but in that internal way where your reality tilts just slightly and everything you thought you knew needs to be re-examined from a completely different angle. I had not written this. I had never written anything like this. I had never felt anything like this. But it was my handwriting. Or something so close to it that if you weren't me, you would not know the difference. I sat on the edge of the bed. I read it 3 more times. My hands were completely steady, which shocked me because inside I was in free fall. I put the letter back in the book exactly as I'd found it. I went downstairs and I made dinner. I did not say a single word about it. That night while Daniel slept, I went through his bedside table drawer very carefully. I found 2 more letters. Same paper. Same handwriting. Same impossible authorship. One of them's dated 14 months ago, talked about my feelings for a colleague at work. Not a real feeling. A fabricated one. A seed planted in my husband's subconscious, in my handwriting, in my words, 14 months before I ever suspected anything was wrong. I put the drawer back exactly as I'd found it. I went back to bed. I lay there in the dark next to my husband, breathing carefully, and I thought, someone has been writing letters as me. And Daniel has been reading them. And this is why he looked at me across the dinner table like I was a stranger. I did not sleep. I want to describe what the next few weeks felt like, because I need you to understand the particular hell of suspicion without proof. I knew what I'd found. I knew what it meant. But knowing and proving are 2 different countries, and the road between them is long and very dark. I went to work every day. I smiled at clients. I drafted specifications for buildings. I came home and cooked dinner and watched television and went to bed, and the whole time underneath all of it there was this roaring, this white noise scream of a question. How far does this go? How long has this been happening? And who? I knew who. I knew almost immediately. The handwriting. The paper. The access to enough details about my life to write convincingly in my voice. The key to our house. The habit of collecting information about me, about my moods and my words and my relationship patterns. The years of subtle, patient, quiet presence. Miriam. But knowing isn't enough. And confronting without evidence means nothing. Daniel would not believe me. I had seen the way he softened around her, the particular childhood love that adults carry for their mothers, the way it bypasses logic and goes straight to the gut. If I walked in and said, "Your mother has been forging letters in my handwriting to make you doubt our marriage," what would he say? What would any man say? He would think I was paranoid. He would think I was trying to drive a wedge between him and his family. He would remember the letters, the ones he thought I wrote, the ones about feeling suffocated and wanting a different life, and he would hold them against my accusation and the math would not work in my favor. So I stopped being a wife. For a while. I became something else. I became careful. I started taking photographs discreetly on my phone of every piece of mail when it arrived before I brought it inside. I started keeping a log. Dates of Miriam's visits. Any changes in Daniel's behavior in the days following. Any shifts in mood, any new distances, any new expressions of doubt. I told no one. Not even Cecile. Not after what she'd said about spiraling. I couldn't risk having my instincts dismissed again when my instincts were the only thing keeping me upright. 3 weeks into my quiet investigation, I made a move I'm still proud of. I'm not a sneaky person. I want to be clear about that. But I am an architect. I am trained to look at how things fit together, to see the structure behind the surface, to identify what holds weight and what is decorative. I applied that training. I bought 2 types of ivory writing paper. One was a common brand. One was specific, a boutique stationery brand, slightly heavier weight, with a watermark visible when you hold it to light. I compared them to the letters from Daniel's drawer. The forged letters were on the boutique paper. I went to the boutique stationery store's website. They had an online order history if you had an account. I didn't have an account. But I knew Miriam preferred to order things online. She'd mentioned it dozens of times. And she was not, it turned out, particularly careful with her passwords, because she used the same one for the family group email chain she'd set up years ago, which Daniel had shared with me because I was, technically, family. I am not proud of what I did next. I want to say that clearly. I don't think it was right. I think it was necessary. There is a difference between those 2 things, and I've made my peace with it. I logged into her stationery account. She had ordered that specific paper 12 times in 4 years. 12 times. I sat very still for a very long moment. Then I started thinking about the box. About 3 years earlier, just after Daniel and I moved into this house, Miriam had brought over some family things, old photos, a few heirlooms, things she wanted stored somewhere safe. We had a guest room with a large closet and she'd asked, gently, reasonably, if she could keep a small box there. A cedar box, she said. For sentimental things. We said yes. Of course we said yes. I had never opened that box. It was her private things. It was not my place. But now I stood outside the guest room closet and I thought about 12 orders of boutique stationery and 6 forged letters and 4 years of a marriage quietly being dismantled by invisible hands. And I opened the closet, and I moved the hanging coats aside, and I found the cedar box on the high shelf. And then I found the panel. Behind the cedar box, there was a section of the closet's back wall that wasn't quite right. I almost missed it. It was subtle, the seam almost invisible. But I'm an architect. I know what drywall looks like when it's been touched. When it's been opened and reclosed and repainted. It took me 10 minutes and a flathead screwdriver to open it. Behind the false wall was a small hollow space. No bigger than a shoebox. And inside that space was another box. Cardboard plain, the kind you get at an office supply store. And inside that box was everything. I don't know how long I stood there. I know the light changed. The afternoon went orange and then gray and I was still standing there on the closet floor, surrounded by papers, and I had stopped being a person and become something quieter and colder and more dangerous. There were 43 letters. 43 letters written in my handwriting, spanning 5 years, beginning 7 months before our wedding. She had started before the wedding. She had started before I was even his wife. She had been building a case against me, a slow, patient, paper-thin case, for 5 years, preparing a version of me that Daniel would eventually not be able to love. There were letters about doubting the marriage. Letters hinting at infidelities I had never committed. Letters expressing emotional withdrawal, disinterest, resentment. Each one careful not to be too extreme, nothing that would make Daniel do something dramatic. Just enough. Just the slow accumulation of a woman falling out of love, described in her own hand over years. There was also in the box a handwritten ledger. I'm going to describe what was in that ledger, and I need you to stay with me. The ledger detailed financial transactions. A private account I hadn't known existed, in Daniel's name but with a beneficiary I didn't recognize. Deposits at irregular intervals. Significant amounts. Not enough to be noticed easily. Enough over time to add up to substantial money being moved away from our joint financial life and into something else. And clipped to the ledger was a document. A legal document. An early draft dated 2 years ago of a separation agreement. In the event of divorce, this document outlined a division of assets that would leave me with almost nothing. Our house had been purchased with money Daniel had before we married. I had contributed significantly to its renovation, to our savings, to our life. But on paper, if you squinted, if you had a certain kind of lawyer, I had very little claim. She had thought of everything. She had been thinking of everything for 5 years. While I set the table on Sundays. While I called her daughter. While I cried happy tears at my own wedding because she'd whispered something kind in my ear. I put everything back exactly as I found it. I repaired the false wall as best I could. I photographed everything on my phone first, every single page, every letter, every entry in the ledger. Then I closed the box. I closed the closet. I went downstairs and I made dinner, and Daniel came home, and I smiled at him across the table. And I fed the man who didn't know his wife had spent the afternoon finding out that his mother had been slowly, carefully, lovingly trying to erase her. He said the chicken was good. I said thank you. That night I cried for exactly 45 minutes. I know because I timed it. I allowed myself those 45 minutes to fall apart completely, to feel the grief of 5 years, to mourn the trust I'd given so freely and had taken so cleanly, to rage at the spectacular unfairness of it. To cry for the babies we hadn't been able to have while this woman was quietly planting seeds of doubt in the man who was supposed to be my partner. When the 45 minutes were up, I washed my face. I looked at myself in the mirror. And I made a decision. I was not going to confront Daniel yet. Not yet. Because confronting Daniel without a plan meant giving Miriam a chance to respond, to spin, to perform grief and innocence so convincingly that Daniel, who still received those letters in his gut as truth, might choose her. And if he chose her, I would be left with the moral victory and nothing else. I needed a plan. And I needed help. The person I called was not Cecile. Cecile was my heart, but this required someone sharper. I called my cousin Marcus, who was a family law attorney in another city and who I trusted completely and had not spoken to in almost 2 years because my life had been so quietly, normally full. I called him at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night. He picked up on the second ring. I said, Marcus, I need you to listen to me very carefully and not say anything until I'm finished. He said okay. I talked for 45 minutes. When I stopped, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Nadia, send me photos of everything. Over the next 3 weeks, Marcus and I built a case. He was meticulous and calm and furious on my behalf in a contained, professional way that I found enormously comforting. We documented the letters, had a handwriting expert, a contact of Marcus's, compare them to genuine samples of Miriam's writing and analyze the stylistic patterns used to mimic mine. We traced the financial account. We documented the timeline of visits against Daniel's behavioral shifts. We also found something neither of us expected. The beneficiary of the secondary financial account was not Miriam. It was a man named Gerald Howe. Marcus ran the name. Gerald Howe was Miriam's former college boyfriend. A man she had apparently maintained a relationship with in some form for decades. A man who stood to benefit if Daniel were to liquidate his assets in a divorce. The picture that emerged was bigger than I had imagined. It wasn't just a controlling mother who couldn't let go of her son. It was a woman who had organized an exit strategy for herself, for a future she wanted, for a financial arrangement she'd been slowly engineering, and who had used my marriage as the machinery to produce it. She wasn't trying to break us up because she didn't like me. She was trying to break us up because a divorced Daniel was more profitable to her than a married one. I need you to sit with that for a moment. 5 years. 43 letters. A hidden account. A man named Gerald. And Sunday dinners where she called me daughter and touched my hand and said she was so glad her son had found someone good. Marcus told me what we needed to do next. He was very specific. We needed one more piece of evidence, something that connected Miriam directly and unambiguously to the letters, in a way that could not be explained away. The photographs were powerful. The stationery receipts were damning. But we needed her voice or her hand, in a way that a room full of people could see. So we set a trap. I want to describe how I felt during those last 2 weeks while the trap was being prepared. I want to be honest about it because I think it's important. I did not feel powerful. I did not feel like a warrior. I felt like a person standing on ice that was cracking, trying to distribute her weight very carefully, trying not to make any sound. There were moments, usually in the early morning before full consciousness arrived and before the armor went back on, when I just missed the uncomplicated love I thought I'd had. I miss not knowing. I miss the woman I'd been before I opened that closet. But then I would think about the letters. About the ledger. About the word daughter spoken in a church on my wedding day. And the ice would solidify again beneath my feet. I invited Miriam to lunch. Just the two of us. I told her I wanted to talk about Daniel, that I was worried about him, that I needed her advice. She accepted immediately and warmly, with that soft, careful smile in her voice even over the phone. We met at a restaurant near her house. Neutral ground, she probably thought. Safe for her. What she didn't know was that Marcus was at a table 12 feet away, with 2 colleagues and a very specific reason for being there. What she didn't know was that I had been given, through Marcus's contacts, completely legal guidance on recording conversations in our state, where single-party consent applied, and I was wearing a small device that was recording everything with perfect clarity. What she didn't know was that I had written her a letter. I'm using her words against her, you see. That felt right. I had written a letter in my own handwriting, my real handwriting, not a copy, and I placed it on the table between us after we ordered. She looked at it. She looked at me. I said, I found the box, Miriam. I watched her face. I want to describe it for you because I will never forget it. There was a sequence, it happened very fast, but I was watching very closely and I saw every frame of it. First, nothing. Complete blankness. Then calculation. I could see her thinking, measuring, deciding which direction to move. Then a performance began to assemble itself behind her eyes. Her face softened. Her lips parted slightly. She was preparing sympathy. She was going to play confused. I cut it off. I said I photographed everything, the 43 letters, the ledger, the account in Daniel's name with Gerald Howe as beneficiary. Marcus has copies. Marcus is also here, by the way. I watched her look at Marcus's table. I watched her look back at me. The performance stopped assembling. What was underneath, it was something I had not expected. Not guilt. Not shame. Something harder than that. Something that had lived a long time behind a very practiced smile. She said very quietly, you were never right for him. I said, I know you believe that. He would have been unhappy, you would have left eventually anyway, You just helped it along, with 43 letters and a hidden account and a man named Gerald waiting to benefit from my divorce. Her mouth tightened. You can't prove. I can, we have a handwriting analyst, we have your stationery purchase history, we have the photographs, we have this conversation. I touched my collar just briefly, just enough. I watched her understand. She was quiet for a long moment. The restaurant moved around us, other tables, other people, ordinary Tuesday lunch sounds, and between us there was a silence with the specific weight of 5 years in it. Then she said something I will think about for the rest of my life. She said, "I love him more than you ever could." And I said, "I know, that's the saddest part." Because I meant it. I think in her broken, consuming way, she did love him. She loved him the way some people love things, as possessions, as extensions of themselves, as evidence that their choices and sacrifices and losses had meaning. She loved him in a way that left no room for him to be a full person with a full life that didn't orbit her. That kind of love is a kind of consumption. And I had been the thing standing between her and the meal she'd planned for decades. I told her what was going to happen. Marcus and I had prepared for this too. There would be no police, not unless she contested anything, not unless she made a single move toward Daniel with any further interference. There would be a legal agreement drafted by Marcus that she would sign. It concerned the financial account and its dissolution. It concerned a restraining distance, not physical but relational, a set of very specific behaviors she would cease. In exchange, I would not tell Daniel everything. Not yet. That part was mine to carry until I decided otherwise. She signed the agreement 3 days later. I still had to go home and tell my husband that the life he thought he'd been living for 5 years had been quietly narrated by someone else. I still had to sit across from the man I loved and tell him that the doubts he'd felt, the ones he'd believed were reflections of reality, had been manufactured. Planted. Tended. By his mother. I did it on a Sunday. A real Sunday, not the ones with Miriam, just the two of us. He made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table. I put the photographs on the table between us. I said, "I need you to look at these, all of them, before you say anything." He looked at them for a long time. I watched his face move through things I don't have words for. He picked up one of the letters, one of the forged ones, and looked at it for what felt like a full minute. Then he looked at me. "She wrote these." It wasn't a question. "Yes. For 5 years. Starting before the wedding." He put the letter down very carefully. He stood up. He walked to the window and he stood there with his back to me for a long time, and I could see his shoulders moving, and I didn't go to him yet because I knew he needed those minutes, and I had learned over 4 years of loving him which kind of pain wants presence and which kind needs space. Eventually he turned around. His eyes were red. He said, "I believed them." "I know. I thought you were pulling away, I thought." "I know. Nadia." His voice broke on my name. "I'm so sorry." I crossed the room. I held him. We stood in our kitchen on a Sunday morning, and the world outside was doing whatever the world does, existing, moving, being ordinary, and the two of us were standing in the wreckage of a war that had been fought in our house for 5 years without our knowledge, and we were still standing. That felt like something. The months after were not simple. I want to be honest. The knowing changed things. Even when you're not the wrongdoer, the revelation of a lie lives in the air for a while. There were nights Daniel would go quiet and I would know he was back inside those letters, rereading them in his memory and recontextualizing them, and there was a specific grief in watching him grieve his own betrayal by his own mother that I could support but not take away. He confronted Miriam. That was his right, she was his mother, and whatever happened between them in that conversation was his to have. I don't know exactly what was said. He came home quiet and we sat together for a long time without speaking, and eventually he said, "She thinks she was protecting me." I know. That doesn't make it. No, it doesn't. He took 6 months away from her. Eventually, and this is the complicated, messy human part, he began seeing her again in a different, more careful, more bounded way. I did not stand in the way of that. I will not stand in the way of a man processing his own mother. What I did insist on, quietly, clearly, without drama, was that she never come to our home without my explicit invitation. That she never be alone with the pieces of our life together. That the key we'd given her came back. She returned it in an envelope without a note. Gerald Howe, I learned later through Marcus's continued attention, moved away. The financial account was dissolved. Whatever arrangement she'd imagined for herself after we divorced, it didn't materialize. Priya sent me a birthday card this year. Handwritten. Old-fashioned and warm. I held it at the kitchen table for a moment before I opened it, and I thought about the first letter I'd found, the one that fell out of Daniel's book, and how I'd stood in my own bedroom with someone else's words in my hands and a floor that had shifted under my feet. It feels far away now. It's not. 5 years is not far away. But something about the telling of it, the fact of its completion, gives it a quality of distance. Like looking at a scar. The wound closed. The shape is still there. But it's no longer bleeding. I am not the same person who made tea on a March Tuesday and heard a woman say he deserves to be so happy. I am quieter in some ways. More careful about which doors I leave open. More deliberate about who gets a key to my life. But I am also not broken. That is the thing I want you to hear. That is the reason I'm telling this story at all. She spent 5 years trying to erase me. She used my own handwriting. She used the vocabulary of my love and turned it into evidence of its absence. She sat at my table every Sunday and called me daughter, and she was systematically, lovingly, precisely dismantling me from the inside. And I'm still here. I'm sitting at the same kitchen table. Daniel is in the next room. We got a dog, a ridiculous, enormous golden retriever named after an architect I admire. We still argue about whose turn it is to call the plumber. He still brings takeout on random Tuesdays. He reached for my hand last night at dinner. That small, ordinary thing. His fingers finding mine across the table, not thinking about it, just doing it the way you breathe, naturally, without ceremony. I held on. If you are listening to this and you feel something wrong in your life that you can't quite name, that 3mm shift, that almost imperceptible wrongness, I want you to trust it. Not the paranoia, not the spiraling, but the quiet signal underneath it. The thing that knows before you're ready to know. I let years pass before I listened to it. I gave every suspicious thing a charitable explanation. I am a person who defaults to trust, and I think that is not a flaw. I think the world needs people who default to trust. But trust cannot mean silence. Trust cannot mean ignoring your own witness. Pay attention to the boxes in your closets. Pay attention to the false walls. Pay attention to the small paper-thin things that, when stacked, become the architecture of a very large lie. And when you find them, be methodical. Be patient. Be more thorough than the person who built the lie, because they had years and counted on your goodness working against you. And then sit at your kitchen table, in your own house, with your dog on your feet and your husband in the next room, and let yourself feel the extraordinarily ordinary miracle of still being here. That's all I wanted to say.